Good morning, everybody. I just wanted to take a moment as people are trickling in to welcome you to our first ever Edmonton and Area Network Summit. My name's Jan Carlson, and I'm a nurse practitioner with the Edmonton West Primary Care Network, and I'm also a member of the Interim Collective Leadership Group and will be one of the co-hosts today. So please help yourself to the breakfast in the back, grab a coffee, grab a table, and we'll be starting in about 10 minutes.
Morning. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to ask that everybody take their seat so that the formal program for the summit can begin. Oh, yeah, I'm just going to adjust that so you can hear me. Sorry. So again, I'm asking everybody to take their seat. Ooh, it's moving. So my name is Karen Chan. Like Jan, I too am a member of the Interim Leadership Group, Collective Leadership Group. And I'm going to be acting as one of your co-hosts today. And we're so excited for the day ahead and so excited to see so many people in person. I don't think I've seen this many people in person in quite some time. So this is pretty amazing. Before we look at our agenda and address some housekeeping issues, I'd like to share a land acknowledgement. So we respectfully acknowledge that we are gathered here today in Treaty 6 territory on the traditional lands of the Cree, Blackfoot, Iroquois, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Métis, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe nations. We acknowledge and respect the past, present, and future generations of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who continue to strengthen Edmonton and Canada. Thank you. And so the purpose of our summit today is that everybody, I hope you have a summit package there at the back if you missed it when you were coming in, and includes an agenda with our formal program, and other package material will be referenced at some point today during our talks. If you're joining us virtually, welcome. You'll find the link to the agenda in the chat box, and you can see sometimes I think you're going to be able to see our Zoom family on the chat there, and welcome to you too. So our purpose today is really to continue to build our network. I think it's going strong already, but it certainly requires more building. We want to launch the network declaration, as well as we want to learn and share information about network building, advocacy, and network activities. We want to ensure participants know how they can be involved in the network as well. And if you look in the agenda, you can see we have a pretty full day ahead, and we're hoping to get you out in good time to miss the downtown traffic. I'm going to get started, and I think Jan is actually going to introduce our next speaker. Thank you so much again for coming.
So we're now going to hear about the development of the community-based senior sector in British Columbia. Karen McDonald, Executive Director of SAGE and also a member of the Interim Collective Leadership Group, will introduce our keynote speaker today, Marcy Cohen. Karen?
Morning, everybody. Thanks, Jen. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce Marcy Cohen this morning. I'm so pleased that Marcy was willing and able to travel all the way to join us here today. Once a fellow Albertan, now a British Columbian, Marcy has always been an advocate. Marcy has over 35 years of experience working as a social and health policy researcher, educator, and advocate, and has been involved in social justice issues as a professional and volunteer for most of her adult life. For 15 years, Marcy worked as a senior policy researcher at a large provincial health union, where she represented the union on numerous policy committees, working with the Ministry of Health and health authorities on issues related to workforce development, home and community care, and healthcare reform. Now retired, Marcy is increasingly interested in promoting resiliency in older adults and supports this interest through her volunteer leadership role with United Way as a co-chair of the United Way of BC's Community-Based Senior Services Leadership Council, which is why we've asked Marcy here to join us today. Not just to hear about her enviable stories about hiking in BC and her gardening, to learn more about her inspiring and very real stories about her groundbreaking work to lead the establishment of community-based senior services sector in BC that continues to grow, thrive, to navigate challenges, and identify opportunities to better serve seniors living in community. Please join me in a warm Edmonton welcome, maybe not quite so warm, a little bit chilly, for Marcy. Thank you, Marcy.
Hi there, everyone. It's really lovely to be here. And I've been here since yesterday afternoon, and I've already learned so much. So, I'm supposed to be here giving the example of what's good, but it's very mutual. So I'm looking forward to more discussions after I present. So I am going to try and tell the story of what happened in BC, how we built our network, what our challenges are, and what inspired us along the way. Okay, here we go. So Bess was one of my inspirations. So in my transition from working with a healthcare union and with a policy institute, I was involved in a 5-year research project looking at changes in home and community care in BC, reductions in access to long-term care and home support, and what the implications were for seniors with a growing aging population. And particularly in home support, a real shift. Like in the 80s, we were leading the country in terms of home support. And then increasingly in the 90s and 2000s, less access to home support, more crisis oriented, more limited in terms of what was available, probably the same story here. And what we decided to do at the end of this is do a video. And what turned out to be inspirational wasn't what I learned about the health system, which was, of course, the problems which people needed to know about, but what was happening in community that really supported people. And so this is Bess. And at that time, when we were making this video, there were some cuts happening by Fraser Health Authority to a community-based service that was providing lunches and outreach and support for seniors. And we had a rally. It wasn't we who had the rally, community had the rally. And the videographer was there. And this is what Bess had to say. I just heard that these little luncheons would no longer take place. I don't know what to do to fill the gap. I can't very well just go to White Spot and sit down at a table and hope somebody will talk to me. So I'm going to miss a great deal when they take away these outings. And who knows, I might become very sick. I might become very blue. I don't know what's going to happen to me. And I don't even really like to think about it. And just so you know, Bess was legally blind. And so she and many other women I met, particularly when I started to take this video out around the community, was kind of what inspired me to shift when I retired to move into this more of a health promotion role and to work with the United Way. So I'm going to just now give you a brief history of how we got started. So before 2016, community-based senior services in BC weren't networked. People were actually in competition for limited funding. And when there were funding cuts like happened at this point, it made it even worse and people were even more isolated from each other. And so when we got a bit of seed funding to bring people together, what people recognized very early on is that this competition was really doing us in, that we needed to be joining together with one voice, and we needed to be showing more clearly the benefits of our programs and keeping people active and engaged and healthy. And that if governments were really committed and really wanted to keep people at home, they really needed to be working with us. And so we really need to make the value proposition, the business case for our programming. And so we got funding, which I will describe in a minute, and we formed something called the Raising the Profile Project. And our approach that we used then and we still use now was to build relationships with Ministry of Health right from the beginning. So we don't have a separate Ministry of Seniors. We have a Ministry of Health where all the programs and all the money siphons from. To really focus on the evidence and go back to the evidence again and again when we're making our arguments and when we're working with government. And the third is a community development approach. And I'll go through each of these one by one. Okay, so sorry that I'm messing this up a little bit. Here we are. So building relationships with the Ministry of Health. So we started out by saying we have a common goal here. We both want to support people to stay at home longer. And we have this to contribute to it and talked about the fact that people needed not just home support, they needed ways to get out and meet people, to break out of isolation, to have connections, have meaning in their life. And it was kind of an aha moment for the ministry when they sort of went, oh, we're just in the middle of doing all this reform work. We're looking at our primary care. We're looking at our home and community care and how to connect them. But we didn't even think about anything outside the health system. And you're actually another sector that could really contribute to what we're doing. And so because of that, they said, okay, we'll match the funding you have from community for this project. And, you know, I have to say that having relationships with the Ministry of Health really helped a lot in making that connection possible. And so it's wonderful to see the connections you have with health professionals and with staff in the ministry, because I think that is so important in building this kind of argument in this kind of case. So the next, of course, is the research. What makes a difference? And this picture is pretty good, I think, in terms of making the point. So the research is really clear. Social support is a key determinant of health, and social connections increases longevity and slows the progression of physical and cognitive decline. And then the evidence around social isolation is so clearly exactly the opposite. It disrupts sleep, raises blood pressure, lowers immunity, increases depression, increases the risk of overconsumption of alcohol, falling, poor nutrition, hospitalization, and death. And this slide I really like to show because it's about one study. It's a Canadian study. It's about 10 years old now, but it really talks about the money proposition. So this study showed that seniors that are inactive cost the health system 2.5 times as much money as seniors who are active. And that was 10 years ago, and that amounted to 5.6 billion taxpayer dollars. So that's not small change. And also what's important in terms of that is that only 12% of Canadians meet the guidelines between 60 and 79 for physical activity. So much improvement that we could make here, and so much different we can make to people's lives, and at a lower cost to the health system. But what really clicked what was the inspiration that got us going was when we went out to community. So we took the things that we learned from the research that we were hearing in interviews that we did, and we talked to the community about them. And what was immediately clear was how motivational that was. For the first time, they could see their work reflected in the literature. What they did mattered. And when we were asking them for ideas about what worked, their voice mattered too. And so that meant that for the last several years, we've had a very motivated local groups who are stepping up in cases of the emergencies that are going on right now from the pandemic, from forest fires, and from the heat wave. And so our sector is very much first responders out in community, and our profile and the value that we see in ourselves has really increased. And that is absolutely the inspiration that keeps us going. Hello. One of the key ongoing issues, so at the end of the consultations, when everything was done, we kind of gathered together all the information that we got, and there was three things that really stood out. One was the difficulties in making connections with the health system. If you had a relationship, that was great, but they were one-to-one personal relationships. It wasn't structured into the system. And if they went, then the ties were not there. And often there was actually an avoidance of connecting with the health system because it's between the health system and us, because they're so overloaded. And if people are being looked after by the sector, well, then maybe it's okay. And then we also heard very clearly that there are more seniors with higher and more complex both health and social needs in the community, wanting to live in the community, but the programming we provide isn't adequate for those people, and we needed to do more for them. And then the last thing we heard over and over again was the balance between volunteers and staff. So volunteers, super important, a big value add of our sector, but you can't just depend on volunteers. We have to have adequate staffing, and volunteers don't come for free, and we don't come for free. So those were three of the very strong key messages that came out. So shortly after that, we had our inaugural summit. And at that summit, we had the declaration, the Community-Based Senior Services Declaration, which you've adapted and are using in Alberta. And we had about 200 signatures. We had signatures from the Ministry of Health, from some municipalities, from healthy aging communities, from chronic care groups, from community-based seniors organizations, provincially and locally. And it was a good process, and it was very motivational. I'd say that I wish we'd had a longer lead time. We just developed the declaration a few months before the summit. And if we'd had a longer time to go to more municipal councils, to actually present, to talk about our ideas, it could have had a lot more impact. So I encourage you to make this a longer process and to do more with it. That was when we moved away from being this independent community group to working inside the United Way. That transition happened at that summit, and we decided to do that because of the support and interest of United Way in a unique partnership that recognized the value of our sector, understood that we would be independent from them in terms of what we were thinking, but really saw the value of working together. And that has been a hugely beneficial part of the work that we've done. And then based on all of this and that report that we gave back to government, we got funding the next year. So the summit was in November, and then early the next year, we got funding for some infrastructure support. So staff support from the Leadership Council, for CORE, which I think you have now, the online platform, for regional consultations, and to support capacity building amongst local leaders in the sector. So before I go on, I just want to lay the groundwork with something that United Way did before we got together with them. I was actually on the advisory committee for this, but this was a Better at Home program, which started in 2011. And I think you have something similar of providing non-medical supports. And it was what came out of a commission because of the shortfall in home support that I've described, but providing housekeeping, friendly visits, transportation, grocery shopping, for seniors now in 100 communities across BC. And those are very valued services, very locally based, lots of support from the mayors in small towns, lots of support in small towns, but often the only service. And it does include snow shoveling. And I did that in my West Coast bias, didn't mention that as an important service, but we do have that included. But you know, there's some real limitations in how government funded it. It was that kind of, oh, we have the volunteers, this won't cost us a lot. And that has really come to bite us. Like, we cannot be so dependent on volunteers. We've got long wait lists for a lot of our programs. And we really are at the point where we want to see a Better at Home 2.0. So shifting back to the funding that we got, so that was in 2011. Then I described, when I was talking earlier, I talked about what we heard from the consultations about higher needs seniors. This funding here is focused on those higher needs seniors who are both using health services and who need better connections between us and the health system and social supports. So we got funding over 2 years for about 75 programs. And they were to be demonstration projects. The funding timing couldn't have been worse, because if you look at the beginning, it was right before the pandemic broke out. So that's caused us some real challenges. And I'll talk about those in a minute. I'm just going to talk about a couple of the inspirational things that did happen despite everything. So one was the social prescribing, which I know you are working on and know about. One of the things we were able to do is we had a physician in Fraser Health Authority who was a real advocate for our kind of work and the value of our kind of programming in preventing and reducing the risk of frailty. And so she worked with us in terms of getting this funding. And she also had taken a frailty network, got it put on the electronic medical record. So physicians and the people working with them in their offices, the social workers and nurses, could identify those people who were at the level of frailty that could really benefit from our kind of intervention. And so that was really helpful in getting doctors on board, but the pandemic hit, not all doctors were ready to do that. And so she, because she was in the health authority, worked with home and community care and got them to look at their assessments when people came in, not just in terms of health, but also in terms of social needs. She also connected us with assisted living. She also connected us with discharge planning. So hugely beneficial in terms of having that inside voice and advocate. And then also she had the capacity to develop training materials. So materials on motivational interviewing, on how to prioritize patients. Now we're looking at inappropriate referrals. And then developing a referral form that made it really easy for both health authority staff and doctors to refer. So those programs are doing really well because of all that support, and that ability to go out to the other health regions is kind of where we're at in terms of that. And then the other one that I want to talk about is a program called TAPS. It stands for the Therapeutic Activation Program. When we went around the province, a lot of groups were talking about the fact that they had seniors who couldn't quite come to the regular exercise program or couldn't make it on their own because their needs were higher. And so some of them were sort of trying to piece a little bit of money together to create some kind of more structured program. And there was one program in Creston that had managed to keep funding and had grown with local support. That did this kind of programming in a really awesome way. It was the Creston TAPS, so near Alberta, and they have a large manual explaining all that they do so people can take from it and build their own. But what they do basically is they work with people who are got mild to moderate dementia, who are living alone, who are isolated, suffered some kind of loss, referred often by a local physician. And they pick people up in the morning. They call them ahead of time to make sure they're there. If it turns out that someone doesn't respond, they put in a secondary system to make sure they know what's happened to that senior. But they pick them up in the morning. They bring them to the center. People come about 2 or 3 days a week. They've done a fairly large, thorough assessment process at the beginning, so they know their health vulnerabilities, but they also know their strengths. And so they really design their programming around their strengths. And they organize their days they organize the people on days according to common interests. And they have a hot meal every day. They have some kind of exercise program. They have recreation or an educational program. It's a really wonderful, wonderful. And I'll just give one other illustration to kind of express kind of the thing they do. So there was a couple of women in the community who were sisters who come from very abusive backgrounds, and they weren't really connecting with anyone. And so they took one of their workers who went out there and just started to play crib with the women. The women like to play crib. They started to play crib with them. And over time, they came into the center and joined the programming. And they use people who are volunteers who themselves have vulnerability, but are more comfortable coming in a volunteer role, and they twin them with someone else. So just really, really thinking all the time about how do you get people connected. And this is what one of the TAP participants said. Suddenly I have a life. I know people. The exercise has helped a great deal. I do activities I don't do at home. I get hugs, which is very important when you're alone. And so just a minute, we went back to the research at this point because the amount of emphasis on frailty, when we first started, people weren't talking about frailty prevention as much. Now it's really a focus. And obviously, because when people are frail and something happens, something negative happens, it has huge impact when usually you could be quite resilient. But it also goes back to the fact that dealing and preventing and delaying frailty is not just a medical issue. It does impact people in terms of what their social situation is. If you're inactive, if you have poor nutrition, if you're isolated, and if you're lonely, those are big contributors to frailty. And so that being recognized is really important. And here is a new statement, or relatively new statement from Doctors of BC. That's our provincial physician organization, recognizing frailty as a public health issue, and recognizing that it doesn't just require physicians' care, it requires multi-sector, multidisciplinary approach. Okay, so then the pandemic hit. And as I said, everything changed. And there was more attention on our sector and more need for our services than ever before. And we had just received this new funding. And basically what we did, the government approached us and said, will you support seniors around the province to shelter at home? And the sector said yes, and the United Way in 2 weeks reorganized all the services around 25 hubs, focused on helping people get groceries, meal delivery, friendly visits on the phone or at the gate, and picking up medications or anything else they needed. And it was, people really felt good about what they were able to do during that period. And the fact that we had a network made it so much easier for us to move quickly. And I know that's one of the things that Karen pointed out as one of the differences than what happened in Alberta. But, you know, over time, what's happened, and particularly since this last year, the people that are staying with the program and needing these services are higher and higher needs, and more of our referrals are coming directly from health. And so this is a quote from one of the service providers really expressing, I think, in a clear way and dramatic way what's happening. The storm of the pandemic has unsurfaced a group of older adults who lived on the edge of vulnerability. They may live alone, have a chronic illness, or be so lonely that it hurts. They may be one of those unfortunate mishaps away from having enough money to cover next month's rent. The onset of the pandemic pushed these older adults over the edge and deep into vulnerability. It also brought to light the sheer volume of older adults who were and still are living in a state of vulnerability, regardless of COVID. So instead of being able to prevent frailty, all those programs that were designed to do that I described, what we've been hit with is a tsunami of vulnerability and frailty. And many of our service providers are still in crisis mode, still having a hard time doing the regular programming. I'm sure it's the same here. We're having trouble with recruitment, retention. There continues to be and is an increasing need for grocery shopping and free food and helping out, getting stuff from the food banks to people's homes. So we are working towards getting back to normal programming, but it is a challenge. The good thing, the silver lining in all this, is that we are working more closely with the Ministry of Health. So although we did have support, it was always at the last minute and always kind of based on, you know, asking for just this one thing. And so you kind of add more programs and more contracts and make things more complicated than you need to in responding to that. So now finally we're engaged in ongoing discussions with the ministry. It's more of a co-creation style of working together, which is really great to see. They made a commitment, the ministry made a commitment publicly at our summit in April to multi-year funding and working towards multi-year funding. And they maintained that commitment and talking about next year as a transition year. They're also finally talking about connecting us again directly with health authority leads around seniors to talk about some co-creation with them, but also where we're not connecting with local health authority people in terms of some of our programming to help us hands-on make those connections and to look at new funding areas like housing with supports and open to new ways of doing things and reducing the contract. So lots and lots of opportunities. And I'd say our support with inside the ministry is really strong, but that doesn't tell us where the politicians are going to go all the time. And we still have challenges there and we still have lots of lobbying to do. And so none of this becomes a certainty until we get more political support. So it's good to see that I heard that you guys were organizing for the election. Very important to do that. Okay, so I'm going to end not with this, but with one last inspiring story. But I'm just going to talk about the turning point we're at, because I think you can hear from my description of what's happening in BC that what's happened, the negative that's happened has created a turning point for us. But Karen and I were on a panel with people from across Canada talking about our sector. And we had someone from Ontario and someone Nova Scotia as well. And everybody is at that same point. And so I just wanted to mention a couple of statistics as a background for your discussions later related to this. First is that Canada underspends in terms of seniors care. So 30% less than the average for wealthy countries. And the amount that we spend on long-term care is greater. So we spend 87% of our seniors' dollars on long-term care and only 13% on home and community care. And compared to the average, which is 65% for long-term care and 35% for home and community care. So always more on long-term care because people are really high needs and it's 24-hour care. But of course, the more you can do the preventative work, the less pressure there'll be in the long-term care system. So I think that's just an important piece of context. And none of these stats take into account our role in our contribution. They're invisible still. The second stat, which relates to that, It's a recent survey by the National Institute of Aging and the Canadian Medical Association that found that, quote, 96% of seniors, people over 65, would do everything they can to avoid moving into institutional care. So I don't think it matters. I mean, it does matter what political party's in power, but it doesn't matter in the sense of this being an issue that's very important and got a lot of resonance in the public and a very strongly held belief, and that more investment is needed. And I hope that that's useful in your deliberations later today. What I want to end with is the story of Frome. It's a town of about 28,000 in southwest England, surrounded by a number of rural counties or communities. And it came out of a primary care office. It came out of a family physician who could see that a lot of her patients needed social support, not medical support, and wanted to turn her primary care center into a, can you believe it, a health center for well-being. The reason I really like it is because of its comprehensive approach, moving things upstream. So as much as possible, making it possible for people to access services before they enter the health system independently by giving them lots of information and lots of access points. But then also providing support for people who have higher needs and who are in the health system and need that support. So that full continuum, not one or the other. So example of what they did near the beginning was the physician working with a community developer decided to ask a local cafe if they would make a table available every Monday morning from 9 to 10, where they could have a talking cafe. And they reached out through social media and through newspapers and to the community and said, if you have any concerns, if there's anything missing in terms of the supports that are available for you, let us know. And someone who had MS connected them early on and said, there's not a lot for people with MS. And so they decided to go through their files and look at all the people on their files with MS in this one practice, and had a focus group, and they thought people would want a support group. But what they were told that people wanted is they wanted an exercise program. So they worked with a nonprofit, got an exercise program that was so successful, they started to do that with other populations with programs, exercise programs that were really connected to their particular needs. And of course, that built that social support among those people who were doing those exercise classes. So that kind of work where you're working with everyone, you're listening to the patients, you're including the community, you're working with primary care, and they even work closely with hospitals. Their program, so we learned about it, people internationally are learning about it, but in Great Britain, most of Wales has this program now, and some other communities, including downtown London in a poorer area. So it is spreading out, it is replicable. And that part of the reason why it is got so much credibility is that they've got really good research. So what they found, and this isn't what their intent was, but what happened was they've dramatically reduced their unplanned emergency unplanned hospital admissions, so admissions through emergency. And that was in comparison to other neighboring counties over the same time period that actually increased the number of people that were coming into a hospital. And so that's I just want to do just a couple of slides that give you a bit more about these programs. So this is the community connectors. And they do signposting, and I'll show you how they do that in the next slide. But signposting is their language. It really means letting people know where you can get information, pointing people to the information points there are. So like those talking cafes that I described. And it's just an hour training, and it's for it's available to everyone. It's mandatory for the police when they start, and they have to repeat it every 2 years. But for taxi drivers, hairdressers, students, doctors, cafes, supermarkets, people volunteer their name, and then parents, grandparents, homeless people, households. So everyone can do this. It's, as I said, 1 hour training. It's making sure people have the information that isn't, that it gets to people, so that when you meet someone in a cafe and they're vulnerable or they're concerned, you can say, I can say 3 places where you might get some information that will help you. And they have 1,800 people doing this. 1,800 people in a town of 30,000 with, neighboring communities. So you can see a large involvement. And so they sort of said with this, if each one made 20 contacts, there would be 36,000 contacts a year being made with this kind of outreach. So it's the signposting. So the first thing they did was develop a website with all the information on it, kind of like our core website, but more geared to the individual, not to the organization, and a directory. Phone. So if you didn't want to use internet, you could phone, and there would be a person on the other end and saying, I'm looking for, or I need help with any number of things. And they would direct you where you could find more or where you could find what you're looking for. And then this physical space, this idea of a talking cafe. So they didn't just do that once or twice. They do that every Monday morning from 9 to 10. And I think 2 or 3 cafes across the town. Then during the pandemic, they created talking benches. So outside places where people could meet and do the same thing. And then they have health connectors. So that's fairly similar to social prescribing, but their health connectors are in the GP offices. There are 11 GP offices. They all have a health connector. Those health connectors are often the person they're talking to at that talking cafe. And very much like social prescribing, they listen to the patient, they develop a plan based on what they want to do. They help them make changes that are meaningful to them, create networks, work one-to-one, run groups. And in addition to the health connectors, I didn't put slides up, but they also do have self-management groups. They also have a team that works with the hospitals for people who frequently come in or their readmission rates. And they also look at what kinds of social supports could help those people stay out of hospital. So a very integrated approach. And this is what the coordinator, the lead for the community said, that little bit of magic, the trust placed in the team and the community is what made the difference. It had a ripple effect and everyone wanted to be involved. And that little bit of magic is what made all that we do possible. Last words to finish on. So thank you.
Thank you, Marcy, for that very inspiring presentation. We appreciate hearing and learning from your experiences. We do have time for a few questions, so we can maybe, if we can grab another mic, and Karen, do you mind taking it around to the ones? Perfect, thank you.
And of course, the people online as
Oh,
well
yes.
could ask questions.
Yeah, if there's anybody virtually that has any questions, just let us know and we can take you off on mute.
Thank you so much, Natalie Jolly from Elder Care Edmonton. My question is, you've referenced a couple of reports at the beginning of your presentation. Are those available somewhere?
Yes, and I can send them to the group here. So one is a 2017 report where we reviewed community-based services, and it does have a lot of the literature. It's very literature focused. It's not that good a communications tool, but it's got lots of good stuff in it. Yes, okay.
Hi, my name is Wendy King. I'm on the board of the Edmonton Seniors Coordinating Council. I have a question around the political will in BC. You did mention it that in the departments you're gaining traction for these initiatives. However, you weren't sure how the politicians or which direction they were going to go. So I'm really curious about what is your how is it that you are influencing those decision makers and those people that approve policy? What is your method in doing that?
Yeah, good question. So, and you know, when we joined with the United Way, because United Way is a funder, they're more limited in being able to do advocacy, and we can do more. And so we do more. But I would say that in some ways you're an advantage when you're completely independent and be able to do advocacy. So, you know, we get the advantage of staffing and collaboration, but that can be tricky. But the way that we've worked it out is the Leadership Council is not the United Way. I'm not the United Way. The co-chair of the council is somebody who's the executive director of a senior center. And all of our members in that network are, you know, executive directors and managers at neighborhood houses, community centers, and they often have a very close relationship with their MLAs. They talk to them regularly. And so that is one of the conduits that we use when we're trying to put pressure on. And so we might do some speaking notes. We really encourage people to talk about their own experience and tie them with the general message we're trying to put on. But it's those agencies that we use very strongly, and in whatever way they can, United Way also tries to do that. But that is a little bit of a trick, or vulnerability in terms of the way we're working.
Hi, Marcy. My name is Marianne. I'm with Shine On Life Memories. And I just wanted to say that you are an inspiration yourself to this program. So Shine On, I think you're awesome.
No virtual questions.
So Marcy will be joining us for the day, and she'll be at the Network Leadership Table Talk later today. So if you want to connect further, then that's the place to find her.
We're running a little ahead of time, actually. Yeah. That is a good thing. We are running a little bit ahead of time. So I think we're going to keep going though, because then if we can give you a little bit more time for lunch, that would be awesome as well. And so the next portion here, today marks a very significant event for our network as we're launching a network declaration. Before we look at the declaration itself, I'm going to invite Mary Whale, who's over there. Hi, Mary. She's a member as well of the Interim Collective Leadership Group and former co-chair of the ESCC, Edmonton Seniors Council, and will give us an overview of the development of our network and why the declaration was created. Thank you, thank you, Mary.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out on this frosty day. As Karen said, my name's Mary Whale. I'm here to sort of give you a bit of a quick snapshot of our history with the development of the network. I'm here as part of the interim leadership group. But I first became aware of the senior sector when I worked in the healthcare system as a gerontologic nurse. And I've learned that not all systems are equal, not all sectors are equal. But I do hope and I believe that by collaborating and working together, we can become more fluid and effective in our common goal. The community is an amazing place. It's just a crazy firmament of life where 75% of health outcomes are directed by social factors. I'm just going to say that again because I think it's so amazing that 75% of health outcomes are impacted by social factors like race, education, economics. And yet that sector, the community-based senior sector, that holds most of the resources that older adults rely on, exists on increasingly scarce and intermittent funding. So what better person did we find to come and speak to us than Marcy? Such a grand experience to share. This is the, oh, that's it. The need to plan for an aging planet started before the beginning of this century with large organizations like the World Health Organization and an International Federation on Aging and the United Nations that spearheaded the movement. And Edmonton kind of jumped on board with the establishment of the Edmonton Seniors Coordinating Council in 2005. Then we became an age-friendly city in 2010. And with great projects like Pegasus, which is noted there in the little tornado, we learned firsthand about collective impact. It was a fascinating experience. And I'll rely on Leonard Cohen's wisdom by bringing in a quote. It revealed cracks in everything so the light could shine in. it was an aha moment. And thanks, Marcy, for sharing your aha moment. For me, working in the healthcare system, to be a part of one of the 7 groups involved in the Pegasus project, where a primary care network housed the development of a telephone program to reach out to older adults in the community. It was brilliant. And it allowed me to experience that bit of sunshine that cracked through the sector, one sector to another, and it was very meaningful to me. And part of our development was bringing cross-sector representation, stakeholders from different sectors to talk about older adult needs, to see common threads between the sectors so we could try and bring them closer together, which is SRT stands for Stewardship Roundtable. Those discussions were fascinating and I think seeded the idea for this network. Sorry, it's not actually up there, but CBSS, of course, stands for Community-Based Senior Sector, which Healthy Aging Alberta is the provincial network that we attempt to align our mandate and work to. And their work is really exciting. I wanted to mention that their framework was developed from the World Health Organization Healthy Aging Framework that was published in 2015. And from that, they've developed this compendium of very adaptive, measurable outcomes that can be applied to any senior service so that we can measure success and collect crucial data so that we can talk to other sectors. So really important work, except I've gotten ahead of myself, sorry. This, you might recognize this. It's the draft roadmap that came out in 2020. That's sort of the foundation for this network. And I won't go into it. It's available online, easy access. So we've had network gatherings since before the pandemic, and because of the pandemic, we did it virtually. And we heard that we needed a baseline understanding. We heard that organizations needed and individuals needed to know how to get involved. We wanted to create a safe space for people to share their concerns, their experience, their resources. It's been amazing that people make these connections in these meetings. Emergent leaders to come forth and share. And another thing that became really apparent, especially another crack in the pandemic, was that the sector is incredibly adaptable, and it was able to pivot and design like the emergency, I can't remember what it's called, the emergency framework for seniors during the pandemic, and the work that was generated, like it seemed like overnight, was just amazing. So a very flexible, adaptable network with everybody collaborating. So right from the very beginning with the Stewardship Roundtable, we knew we didn't want to have a hierarchy. We didn't want to be an organization. We wanted to be a network led by a group of thinkers. So the result in our search, our first search for the interim leadership group, came up with this motley crew here. And I can say that because I'm part of the motley crew. We all have blue tags, those of us that are here today. And I know that Nigel is on the Zoom presentation, part of our group. An amazing group of, oops, can I go back? Oh yeah, a wide variety of knowledge and experience. We've is and then bringing it back to the bigger group to refine, which is how we came up with the declaration. Oh, so again, from the network gatherings, input and all the thoughts in our journey, we know that we want a collective voice. We know that we have to have that common agenda, that common understanding. We know that we need a wider appreciation of the sector to galvanize into action and advocacy. So that's what the declaration, that's what we hope the declaration will inspire. Our discussions in the past, and brought it to published it in a link letter and brought it to the network gathering October 12th for input. We edited it from that and have come up with sort of 4 rationale statements with a core mandate, which I'll go through now. And a lot of what Marcy said just totally resonates with all these statements. And like we just know that older adults want to age in the community of their choice. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. This thing is very finicky. And as I said, we know that up to 75% of health outcomes are influenced by social factors, non-medical factors. That the community-based senior serving sector is adept at providing these necessary services. The sector is evolving into an incredibly sophisticated matrix of social capital that we know needs more support to be effective. And it needs the recognition. This declaration is a call for advocacy. It's a call for recognition. It's a call for action to a much needed shift to address the growing demand for older adults to age in the community. It's not just about older adults, it's about everybody. You know, we're all going to get there. We've created this opportunity to share the declaration. Hopefully everybody will sign it today, but no pressure. We're here to discuss, to answer questions. We love feedback. Yeah, and that's the story. Will be, like I said, lots of opportunity for discussion and answering questions. Ask a blue tag person. Okay, thank you very much. There a question?
Oh, there might be. Go ahead. Let's see if we can get you a microphone. Oh, not online. Just 1 second. I'm coming. Here you go.
I don't know if this is the right time to ask this question, but I'm going to put it out there. We live in a condo and the doors have to be closed because of fire regulations. We have a social room with no router. We don't have a TV in the social room. We have no motivation in the building to get people out of their suites. So everybody stays in their suites. It's a 4-story building. And as you say here, you need a social and physical base to grow, but a lot of people just stay in their units and they don't come out. And do you have a blueprint of some sort for buildings like this where a senior over 55 to design some sort of social system to get people out of their suites, like suggesting a router, maybe morning exercises in front of a big screen TV in the social room, anything like that?
Good question. Does anybody want to chime in on
Yes.
that?
Just to add to that, we've been there for 10 years now and we watch people doing this
Yeah.
and we've seen a lot. Well, 20 people have left our building since we moved in 10 years ago now.
So I guess
So-
it's one of the challenges of living in a private kind of condo as opposed to an assisted living kind of place where all those activities are organized. Okay,
Yeah, hi.
Mary Ann,
It's
go
me
for it.
again. I live in a condo as well, and we have a very strong social committee that organizes activities like that, and it really works well for us. So just a social committee, 4 or 5 people that live in the condo, and it works really well. Oh. Well, I was told by the board that if you ask too many people, you don't go anywhere, so they just make decisions.
Oh, here we go. Just 1 second here.
So I don't have the specific answer for you, except, some stuff around what helps people live and stay in those condos longer and not have to go into the long-term care facilities certainly is something that would be really great if we had some more, information like that available to help you out. But I just want to say that there's a lot of momentum about what you're saying. So there was just a report published this month from a group called the National Institute on Aging on NORCs, what they call them, naturally occurring retirement communities. I'm seeing lots of nods here. And they've defined it really broadly. So it includes condos, it includes rental buildings, it includes affordable rental buildings, it includes seniors only buildings, it includes a neighborhood which is closely together, like anything where you've got an increased concentration of older people, which is not intended for care, but where you can look at bringing in supports in an economical way. And so, one of the programs that exists here, started by some university people in Kingston, is something called Oasis. And it's written up in that report. And in Oasis, they focus on those 3 things I talked about: nutrition, physical mobility, and social connection. And they involve the residents. They use a really community development approach to kind of get people engaged. And they've got research showing that it's reduced the use of hospitalizations and community care. And it's just growing very quickly. The issue you're raising is an issue that a lot of people are raising right now. And I think that report and that institute is national, and they're calling for a national strategy and funding. So I think it's great.
Thank you so much, Marcy.
Maybe just to add to that, when the pandemic happened, a lot of senior centers started delivering virtual programming. And at Sage, where I work, we have a lot of seniors who aren't quite ready to come back to in-person programming. So we continue to offer virtual programs. And we were able to secure some grant funding to install technology so that when we're running in-person programming, that programming is now available online. So if we're running like a fitness class, like a Tai Chi class, you can actually watch it online and participate virtually. So if we could manage to convince your condo members to have the technology inputted into the facility, they could actually participate online. I think there's several other senior centers that are still running virtual programming. And then starting in the new year, there's a new program where we're able to expand some community animator supports into different parts of the city, where the animator works with community members to support that community to run programming within their community. So we could connect you with those resources to support your community to self-organize, which I think is kind of what I'm hearing you need. So I'd be happy to connect you with that.
That would be appreciated. We have resistance to putting the router and TV in the social room because it costs money. And so there's no motivation for people to come out, except for maybe 4 times a year we have a gathering in the social room for events. But that would be good to have a blueprint or a list of suggestions for a place like ours. So appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's what we're hearing actually, is that as a community, we're quite strong. Maybe I don't have a blueprint for you, but somebody does, right? Sorry, I'm just gonna, is it a quick one? We got a little bit.
Thanks, Karen. My name is Jesney Parmar. I'm a care of the elderly physician, and I've worked in the Edmonton zone and surrounding areas, caring for elderly for the last 30 years. I want to congratulate the Edmonton seniors serving sector. I've been watching and I've been involved peripherally, and I've seen the sector evolve. And I'm thrilled to be here today at your launch. So may I begin by congratulating you for what you've taken on and what you continue to do. I may come from a bit of a biased point of view because the average age of the senior I look after is over 80. So I do see a lot of frailty. And most recently, we've started in the Edmonton zone in home care, home-based assessment and management of seniors. So seniors who are frail, mostly housebound, can now get geriatric consultative services that's embedded in home care that does co-management with family physicians and brings the resources to bear to manage older adults in their homes. What I'd like to shine the light on, which I see somewhat not transparent in your declaration, is support for family caregivers of older adults. So yes, I'm all for, identifying frailty, early prevention of frailty, what we are doing for seniors and we need to continue to do. But what we have seen, and Dr. Anderson is here, in the crowd who's been helping me do this research for many years now, where we are trying to get the healthcare system to support family caregivers of all ages, but particularly older adults. And what the pandemic unfortunately did, not only did it marginalize, seniors for multiple reasons when it came to access to health and community care. It increased the burden on family caregivers. So there was rapid deterioration. We're not just talking about deterioration of the mental and physical health of seniors, but also of their family caregivers. And we have published 2 reports now. And the reason I bring this to your attention is that in your declaration, and I know it's embedded in there somewhere, when you do your work, you do support the family caregivers because often they're the ones who help seniors access supports when they can do so. But it's not transparent. It's not explicit. If you remember the issue that arose with not allowing family caregivers to enter our healthcare system and what that did, to the care of the seniors in our continuing care system, in our acute care system, because it took away the support family caregivers provided them. And we know 10 to 30% of that care in our continuing care system, which is, I'm talking about supportive living, long-term care, is provided by family caregivers. And of course, what we also ended up doing, and I'm going to say this tongue in cheek, it's not just the healthcare system that increased the load and length of caregiving onto family caregivers, but also the social care system. So as we go about developing these services, whether it be in healthcare or in the social sector, we have to keep those caregivers in mind. We cannot keep signaling and keep asking family caregivers to do more. So it's all very well to develop these resources and have the family caregivers access them for the seniors who can't. We have to assess the needs of the family caregivers from their lens, as well as not just to sustain care, which we're all busy trying to do, is get family caregivers, whether it's the healthcare system or the social care system, to do. But we also have to be looking out for the health and well-being of these family caregivers, because they are critical, not just to the healthcare system, but they are backbone of the care for seniors in our society. So I'll stop there. And I hope I didn't upset anybody with my comments.
Thank you, Jesney. So I think everyone has a lot to say. So we're actually going to spend some time now in table discussions. For the tables who have small numbers of people, please, please, please join another table, have more discussion there, and feel free to move around too if you want to, right? So, we want to provide an opportunity for the allies and organizations who are ready to sign. We recognize not everyone is ready to sign, and that's okay. The promotion and signing the declaration will be ongoing. And I always kind of see this too as not necessarily a dead document, right? Everything is always living in my mind and can always be changed. But this is what we have right now. And, we've kind of come to mostly a consensus about it. So we're trying to work on this as it is. So as I mentioned, we have table hosts, usually for most of the tables. And your table host will facilitate the discussion that focuses on the key issues of readiness to sign the declaration and perhaps how to promote it. You'll be asked to explore the following questions. What do you think influences readiness to sign the declaration? What factors might an organization or individual consider? How can we collectively promote the declaration? And are you willing to help do this in your organization or community? And what tools do you need? So we'll take about 20 minutes. So at around 11 o'clock is when we end. We're still running a little ahead of time, so that's perfect. And as we are having the table discussions, there's an opportunity to sign the declaration using the declaration QR code in your agenda. We'd also like to use our declaration visual, which you see over there as well, to show support that's building for the declaration. When an ESCC staff member comes to your table, if you are ready to sign the declaration, please go to the visual and place your business card or a handwritten card with your name or organization directly on the visual. You can use your phone to sign the declaration as well, using the QR code that's on your agenda. So I'd like to begin the table discussions. Thank you so much. Just everyone's attention. You have 3 or 4 minutes left. I see lots of wonderful discussions. So please continue and we'll let you know when it's 11. And please take the opportunity if you want to sign the declaration, and all through the day, it'll be available.
Okay, you guys are really having some great discussions by the looks of it. So I apologize for having to bring the table discussions to a conclusion. We can keep building on these conversations over lunch. We can keep building on the visual over lunch. So should you wish to post your name and organization, you can do that over there. We really see that the momentum and support is building for the declaration. So your input during these table discussions will support us to continue to build this momentum. So thank you. So we're now going to hear a presentation by Peter DeVos. This session will introduce us to concepts and strategies for mobilizing change. The hope is that the insights generated during this session will have some practical applications to the advocacy efforts to support the community-based senior serving sector. It is now my pleasure to introduce Peter DeVos. Peter is a facilitator, change agent, and visual storyteller, drawing on methods from the worlds of social innovation, strategy, community organizing, and anthropology to help community-based organizations navigate an increasingly complex world. As a former community organizer, he believes in the power of citizens to create positive change. Peter has a PhD in anthropology and is going to speak to us about network building, how we can use the declaration to support network development and advocacy. Peter?
I guess I should adjust this thing a little bit. Hey? Okay, that's great. Thank you. Or I could just grab it. Maybe I'll just grab it. Okay, welcome everybody. So I'm hoping that what I'm going to share with you now is going to build a little bit on what we've talked about this morning. Some of this stuff I think will have echoes to some of the lessons that came out of the BC experience. And I think it's also going to have application for the work that we're trying to do here today. So the concepts that I'm going to share with you today kind of come from a couple of sources. Number one is I was at one point a community organizer. And so I had a lot of experience with seeing the impacts of bringing people together, helping them organize so that they have a voice, and then seeing the changes that come about through that work. And I've also had the good fortune of sort of being able to look at some of the literature on how this is happening in other parts of the world. So there are very strong sort of organizing traditions in places like Australia, the UK, parts of South America, where citizens and community groups have really come together to create change in their neighborhoods. And so what I'm going to share with you here comes from practical experience, and it also comes from some of those other sources. So what we're going to talk about here is really what is organizing and why do we want to advocate? What are some of the basics when we think about what organizing means? And then we'll get a little bit more into advocacy and thinking about how organizing connects to advocacy. Okay, so why organize? And I'm using the word organize here because it implies that we're bringing people together in a very strategic and intentional way to create impact. One of the reasons I think we organize here, and when I talk about the word organizing, I'm talking very much about what it means to connect people together in a way that, whoa, why is this thing? I'm getting chat boxes flying up here. Okay. Okay. So let's just wait a second then and figure that out. Okay, well, I can sing for 41 seconds if you'd like. Should I wait for them to come off here, or should I just keep motoring along? Okay. All right. Yeah, what song can I sing? Yeah, that's right. Okay, so anyway, so let me jump into, well, eventually I'm hoping this little magic screen will disappear up here. So organizing in our world that I came from is really about identifying, recruiting, and developing leadership. It was about finding those key allies in your community and bringing them together. It was about creating intentional public relationships. So relationships with others where we can act together in public life. And it was really about creating the capacity to act, understanding that when we come together, we increase our ability to create change in the world. So where organizing sits on a sort of continuum is it's a sort of higher level of engagement that's a little bit more than just reacting to something in the moment. I think in our world, we have lots of times where people come together and we mobilize around a particular issue. For example, and we see that in some communities. We've seen that, for example, in the communities with people with disabilities, where government makes a policy change and then the community and families quickly mobilize, come together to resist that change or to inform that change. Organizing is a little bit deeper because what you're actually doing is, it's more like network weaving. You're actually building sustainable relationships over time that allow you to act. So it's not just a one-time thing, and it's not just reactive. Oh, sorry, wrong button. Why organizing matters is I think in our world, we're often quite isolated from each other. And I think the story that we heard from BC was even in their early days of their development. They found that they were actually organizations that were not only isolated from each other, but in some cases were competing with each other. And so the challenge is, how do we get past that competition level and what mechanisms can help us work together? In the organizing landscape, we really saw the bridge to working together as being leadership, okay? And I mean leadership in the sense of people that care about their communities, that can speak to others, and what that leadership really does, and I think that's what we're seeing with the development of your network, is a form of leadership emerging amongst community-based senior serving organizations. What that leadership does is it allows you to sort of identify, develop a shared story, build commitments to each other that matter, start to think about effective ways of structuring your activities. Out of that leadership comes creative strategy. Out of that comes the potential for effective action, right? So you're moving from a state where you might have been more disorganized to a state where you're more organized, more purposeful, more intentional. And things like a declaration are a tool that helps you develop that shared story, and it helps you start to create that intentionality. So the basics of organizing is pretty simple, and I think you've done that. I think we've heard stories even in the BC example of what created organizing. When I organized, the key essence of our organizing was really started with listening. It's through listening to others and building some of those relationships that we develop a sense of common purpose. We see where our mutual struggles are, and we start to imagine new possibilities. But it's not just listening. You have to then take that listening and turn it into something. And so typically what would happen after you listen is you spend some time to make sense of what we heard. What are the key issues? What are the opportunities? Who are the potential allies that we can work with? And you take that listening and you turn it into strategy. You turn it into action, and then you evaluate those actions because you want to make sure that what you're doing in the world is having impact. And we know that our world is very complex. So sometimes we don't even know what those impacts are until we try something. So part of the organizing cycle is that planning, acting, evaluating, and then using those lessons to drive future actions. There's three things that we thought when I organized that we thought were essential for creating change. And I think we've heard some of that from the BC story too. Number one is we have to lift up the stories of those that are most impacted. Okay, we have to be able to personalize these stories. We need to be able to tell the story of a BESS or of a senior that's being impacted by a particular situation, or a story of a senior with their hopes and their ambitions. So that's important. The second thing that we need to do is we need to back up that story with a little bit of analysis and context, because otherwise it just becomes sentimental. So human stories matter, but we need to back that up with a rational argument around what are the impacts, what are the costs, what are the benefits, much like they did in BC when they developed the report that talks about the importance of comprehensive models of healthcare. So those are two elements that are necessary, but I think the third one is also necessary. We need some influence and leverage to uplift those stories and to move those arguments into places where they can affect change. So that's really, I think, where things like network weaving come in. It's not just the top parts of that equation. It's about mobilizing your human connections and creating influence for change. So in the organizing world, there's a couple of things that was important for us. Number one is we really understood that listening drives action. Okay, it's really by going out and listening to your people and listening to your potential allies that you even start to figure out what are the things that we can act upon. And sometimes we learn new things, like even today, we've learned, even in our discussions today, new issues have surfaced. Some of those issues might be action opportunities in the future. Oh, has it moved? I don't know if it has. Oh, here we go. Okay. The other key thing about organizing is that it really comes down to making something real at the end of the day. If we want to affect change in the world, it's not simply about coming together and talking. We have to sort of aim those efforts at something that's real. And that could be the development of a new program. So you do all your listening, and what comes out of that is a model of change, like social prescribing. You do all that listening and analysis, and out of that comes your efforts to influence a policy or a piece of legislation. You're aiming your organizing at something. Or maybe some of your organizing is trying to get at deeper things. You're working together in a way where you're trying to influence the societal attitudes for seniors, for example. Some of your work might be at that deeper level where you're challenging mental models. The other key piece around organizing that I think applies to your advocacy work too is that organizing really works best if you have clear targets and goals. So you do have to take some time to really figure out what is it that we're trying to what's the change that we're trying to affect, who do we need to engage, and making sure that you aim your efforts at something and then you evaluate whether you're achieving results. And the other part of all of this stuff is I think action matters. In our experience, when I organized, we realized that action in a way is the oxygen of your organization. You have to do stuff together in order to keep people motivated. And you have to pick things that that are motivating to act on as well. So one of the challenges in organizing is we want to avoid a situation where we're picking a target that's too big for us at the beginning. Nothing is more demoralizing than trying to achieve a target that's greater than your capacity. So part of the strategy is to figure out things that are big enough that you can win on, small enough to be winnable, but big enough to make a difference. Okay. And that's part of what comes out of the listening and the sense making. So the big journey of organizing really is starting, I think, from a sense of who we are as people. So the center of that work, and I think this is a key part of what the network has done, is really figuring out who we are. What's our purpose? What are the values that matter to us as organizations? What's the change that we want to create in the world? So the first change is an internal one. And then from there, we start to build relationships with others, we bond, we create bridging relationships, and eventually we get to a place where we can start, because we've built that strong unity, we can also start to engage other stakeholders in that shared purpose. Okay, so what are some of the factors shaping advocacy? So I'm going to shift a little bit here to the advocacy piece, but I'm hoping that I haven't lost you completely. There's a strong connection between organizing and advocacy. Advocacy really is more what are we going to do in the moment to affect a change on something? And there's a couple of things that influence that, right? One is context. Context matters. If you're developing an advocacy campaign, you need to know the conditions that you're attempting to create change in. That includes timing. Timing is critical. It includes the question of power. How much influence or clout do we have on this particular issue? And it also includes a sort of an assessment of the risk and rewards, right? If we attempt to act on this issue, what can we gain and what could be the potential negative outcomes of attempting to push on an issue? All of those things are the kind of things that you would potentially consider as you're doing your advocacy work. So advocacy really comes in different forms, okay? I think sometimes when we think of advocacy, we jump straight to things like public protests and stuff like that. That certainly is a strategy that some organizations use, and maybe if you're pushed too far to the limits, that becomes a credible position, but there's other places on that advocacy continuum. One form of advocacy is to actually develop a pilot program and then test it and show the benefits of it and then work with others to scale that out. So social prescribing might be seen as something that's in the advocacy space. Another form of advocacy is when you really start to collaborate with others and you start to figure out, can we work on things together to create new pathways, to share resources in new ways? Sometimes advocacy includes litigation. We're starting to get into more sort of potentially tension-filled forms of advocacy, but there are organizations that have used the court system, for example, to support their causes. And you see that a fair amount in the Indigenous world, where Indigenous communities have used the Supreme Court, for example, to move towards more self-determination. Advocacy is also another strategy that I'm sure you're aware of, is lots of efforts are given to doing things like public education and media campaigns. When this is more sort of trying to build social awareness around an issue. Research is also a form of advocacy. So I'm actually working right now with Healthy Aging Alberta to try to help set in motion something to help build a case for the sector. And that's a form of research that potentially becomes a tool. And then there's all the stuff that happens in the world of persuasion. And that's where we leverage relationships to try to affect change. That includes things like lobbying. It includes things like the clout you build, because as you build your network, you increase your credibility and your influence on issues. And it includes, in some cases, forms of negotiation, right? A lot of what I was involved with when I was organizing was getting to a table of decision making so that you can negotiate something with somebody else. And then and then through that negotiation, potentially move the needle. And then the other parts of advocacy strategy, constituency building. I think that's a key thing that that's happening both at the local level here with the network and at the provincial level, where you're trying to build a constituency that's seen as a legitimate voice on issues, and that creates a platform for seniors to also have their voices amplified. And a fair amount of advocacy work also sits in that empowering space. So in some cases, advocacy might include what you're doing to help support those people that you're serving, actually, to be able to speak on their own behalf. So timing matters. And I imagine that as you look at this screen here with some of these variables that you might consider as you're doing your advocacy, there's a number of those things coming alive already, right? Elections, I think that's a key moment in time to think about positioning your work. International events and policy opportunities are also open up windows where you can advocate. And a recent example is COP27. So if you're, for those organizations that are really involved with issues of climate change and environmental justice, COP27 would be a key moment to get your voices out there. Sometimes advocacy windows open up when there's different parts of a process, in a legal process, for example, or a policy process. So for example, if the government of Alberta is interested in reimagining primary care in the province, that might be a key opportunity to bring the community-based social determinants of health stuff into that discussion. And then the last piece, I think, is crisis or emergencies. And we heard a fair amount of that this morning. COVID created a crisis, which also, I think, amplified the urgency of some of the work that you're doing. It also showed us in sort of very direct terms that seniors in some cases are forgotten parts of our community. Okay, now we're getting into the game of power here. And I'm curious when I share that word up there, because I know people have different reactions to the word power, but when we organized, we were very concerned about power. In fact, we were trying to build it. I'm curious from your point of view, what kind of things come up when you hear that term power? If anybody wants to just throw out a couple of reactions to that term, what does power mean to you? Sorry? Okay, ability to achieve, and you said control. Okay. Persuasion is a form of power. Money is a form of power. Anybody else? Knowledge is a form of power. Absolutely. So there's different forms of power or different almost capacities that power represents. When we organized, we simplified the arrangement. We basically said that power equals the ability to act. In other words, to achieve a purpose. Everybody wants the ability to act to achieve a purpose. The question is, we know in our world that it's not always equally distributed who has a voice and who has influence. In our world, building power was as simple as bringing together organized people and organized resources. Okay. And I think that's another function of what happens in networks. You bring your people, your talent together. In bringing those elements together, you also potentially bring in other forms of resources. In some cases, they could be financial resources that you bring together and shift how they're used. It could be all of the other resources too. I know that a lot of your network development work is also anchored around sharing best practices, et cetera. So organizing, when we organized, we kind of looked at four main types of power that we were very interested in. One was people power. And so that is the power that comes from strength in numbers. Another was influencer power. We were interested in building up enough of a legitimacy that we could have the backing of other influencers as well. So we know that in our society, there's many other potential power holders. So building enough capacity to get to influencers was a key part of what we were trying to achieve. In some cases, you're organizing to create what I would call independent political power. It's not power tied to a political party. Okay, it's not that you're aligning with a left wing or a right wing or a moderate. It's the power of an organization to shape the political agenda, to be part of that conversation. And then the last piece, I think, is the deeper forms of advocacy actually get at narrative, get at narratives, reframing society's attitudes towards something. It's likely that through your advocacy work, you might be trying to leverage all or varying degrees, different types of power, as you see here. One useful tool, I'm just going to check and make sure that I'm still on schedule here. One useful tool for looking at power is kind of thinking about where it manifests, okay? And this is a key part of strategy. So power sort of appears in different levels and in different places. And there's different, so for example, when we organized, we understood that if we wanted to have influence over issues in a neighborhood, we needed to have neighborhood level relationships. We needed to go out and get to know those local business people, the people, the citizens. We needed to have connections with the churches in our neighborhood if we wanted neighborhood level influence. If we wanted city level influence, guess what? We would need to build relationships with organizations that have influence at a city level. So we need to build to the scale that you want to have influence at. So for example, I think a lot of what's happening here through the network development work, that's to have influence over a metropolitan area, right? Pretty significant. You have to have relationships across a big area, a very diverse city. But some of those relationships you're trying to tie into other efforts to build a voice at the provincial level, which means you then need to engage all these players that have potential regional influence and provincial influence. I think the most interesting part of this, though, is looking at this, the places that power manifests, because this is where you might have influence. So power kind of shows up in different places. One is visible spaces, okay? So that a visible space, for example, is City Hall. That's a place where we know power manifests and decisions are happening. And as citizens on certain issues or as organizations, we can go enter City Hall, a visible space, and influence that decision-making process by the arguments we make, the number of people we deliver into City Hall. So we're now playing in a visible space. And some of your strategies down the road might involve some of that work. Another place that power manifests is hidden spaces. So these aren't necessarily in City Hall, but these are the sort of back channels that you have to politicians and to decision makers, the kind of back channels that you develop through your relationships that you can also activate. So you don't always activate things in the public space, in the visible space. You can also activate them in the hidden environment. And then there's always invisible forms of power that are a little bit harder to get at. And that's where we're getting into the values and norms in our society. They're a bit harder to influence. It's hard sometimes to influence a system that you're swimming in, but some of the more successful social mobilization stuff has activated those invisible things as well. And then the last thing is the spaces here. This is an interesting space for advocacy as well. There are closed spaces that we as citizens don't have access to. So for example, a cabinet meeting. We don't have access to a cabinet decision-making process. It's closed. There's often no record even of what was discussed in a cabinet meeting. So those are spaces we can't necessarily get into, and they happen at different scales. There are invited spaces, however, where if we have enough influence, we get invited into a decision-making space that somebody else has created. So for example, if the Alberta government wants to talk about transforming seniors care, it might very well say we need to have the Edmonton network at the table, because we know that they're credible, we know that they have lots to offer, and we know if we don't involve them, there might be a consequence. People might be upset. So you might be invited into that space. The third area here I think is very interesting, and it's part of, I think, what you're doing, is you can create your own space and then invite people into that space. If you have enough organized people and organized resources, you can create a policy discussion and then invite the city to participate in that, invite the province to participate in that. And we've seen that happen at the municipal level here. Years ago, for example, there was very little discussion in the city about things like urban agriculture or preserving farmland. Some of that work was a created space. It was created by my friend Michael Walters, was very involved in that work early on to create a space for that discussion. So that's a space that you might have a lot of play in, the created space. So here's the other thing to consider as you work with this change stuff, is that you kind of need to understand what are the pillars that hold up the current system that we have. And so that most effective sort of advocacy and change processes aren't about blowing up the system as much as they're about figuring out where the pillars of support are and then winning people over to your side. And oftentimes you'll find, and that's maybe the difference between the ministries and the political piece of the equation. From the BC example, it sounds to me that they built a lot of very good relationships with the bureaucrats that care about these issues, that are lobbying, that are internally doing advocacy work to push for certain policy changes. They have lots of support within the bureaucratic pillar. Still trying to figure out whether the political pieces align with that or not, but certainly lots of efforts were undertaken to work with those institutions. And in our society, those institutions include things like government, but they also include other pillars that hold up our system, right? So for example, faith institutions are another part of our society that shape people's values, create a space of, so when we worked as community organizers, we also understood the importance of animating relationships with faith institutions, because we wanted to go where we knew people were already going. So how do you bring some of these folks into the mix? Okay, I won't get too much into that. I think we've talked about that already. The slide will be shared with you, but it does give you a kind of a sense of the different strategies you would use in those different spaces. So this whole business of getting to the tables of decision, I think, was a key consideration when in my earlier work, which is really how do you get to a place where you can work with others to make the deal? And what I mean by making the deal would be shifting a policy or shifting a funding formula. So that's making the deal. So you'd want to build enough influence so that you can get to the table to make the deal. You want to build enough influence so that you can ensure that others keep the deal. Okay, because we also know in our society, if we don't create pressure, sometimes there's backsliding that happens. So you have to keep the deal, and then you hope to build enough credibility and influence that you can expand the deal. You can go bigger. And part of that work is figuring out your allies. And so a key strategy that's involved in both organizing and advocacy is kind of figuring out on a spectrum, where do people fit? We know that on certain issues, not only will we have supporters, but we might have opponents. And we might have other people that are sort of in the middle. They're neither a supporter nor an opponent, but they're just in the middle. So part of a strategy of advocacy is to figure out how do we neutralize the opponents? How do we shift people from being passive to being more engaged with us? So you want to shift those friendly neutrals over more into the active role. And then how do we take some of those folks that we're already working with and deepen our engagement with them so that they're even more active and part of the process? So you might be able to do a bit of a systems map at some point on a particular issue and figure out where people sit. And that would shape your messaging and your strategies. So I want to give you a few seconds here, a few minutes here, maybe 5 minutes or so at your tables. Just have a quick conversation. And I could stretch this a little bit, but I'm curious to hear from you. Who are some people that you feel could be key allies to your cause that you're currently not engaged with? So maybe just take 5 minutes and then I want to just pull a few things out. In a perfect world, you'd sit here and you'd scribble lists of names and things, but I'm curious to know like who could be an ally to your cause, but that you currently aren't engaging with.
Hi all. So for anybody who's on the online group, feel free to unmute yourself and share your thoughts to this question, or you can post your comments into the chat and we can moderate it that way. Cultural organizations, that's one I've been thinking a lot about for coordinated outreach to, Mary. I think it's really important because they're such knowledge keepers of how to meet people and how to be with people.
Yeah, and the way I think about this is, for example, my parents' generation, like they moved here in the 60s and they founded these cultural organizations which have branched out. There's like 2 or 3 versions of the same, cultural organizations now in Edmonton, and they're all seniors now, right? They've been around for 50 years, so they're seniors now. So those individuals may not play an active role in leadership within those organizations, but those organizations play a pivotal role in bringing those communities together for celebrations, like for heritage keeping and stuff like that, right? So it's a really great way to understand the needs of those communities.
And they're the knowledge keepers in so many ways. Like they have access to understanding what are people facing. People come to them and say, I don't know how to get this or that. And sometimes that's the first place they'll go because that's where they always go.
Yeah.
So it's such a cultural background for so many people. Are there other places, folks, that you are not currently engaged with that you'd love to engage with? Feel free to answer in the chat.
Sorry, folks, somebody had a question here, and this may be a great illustration of why listening matters. The question is, what's the cause? Okay. I think the causes I'm kind of referring to here is the cause of creating an environment where seniors in the Edmonton area can age in the right place with dignity in ways that preserve their health care, that allow them to be full participants in their communities. And so that's the bigger cause. I think the other cause is, who do we need to bring and who do we need to bring into that discussion if we wanted to actually have a community-based system of support that can allow that to happen. So who else do we need to talk to?
One group I've been thinking about a lot is seniors themselves, and actually how do we collaboratively and enthusiastically involve seniors. I know that seniors are so connected to senior centers and are engaged in that regard, but to actually have them really be core to who we reach out to and to be an active participant in development would be really interesting.
One of the groups that I was in a another conference webinar this morning that they're talking about system change. And one of the big groups that they talk about are arts organizations. So, you know, for perspective, but for also telling the story and getting the story out there in different venues was seen as really key to that. And I think also going back to what you were just saying, is that, you know, there's seniors in arts programs, and so they may have a different perspective around, you know, how to do this work if you're tapping into them through the interests that they already have.
Yeah, and I used to work for the Heritage Council, and we had lots of seniors who were volunteers. We had pretty much every age range, and the cultural and arts sectors are really big places for how we tell stories about our community. And that storytelling is a really important thing to capture about how we engage our community.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Something that I wanted to share from the point of view of communication, that he was talking about building on the content and to those communities as a communications professional and as an immigrant myself, just by thinking outside the box. And I think that was part of our group. The group that was with me, we were talking about that. I was mostly listening, but I think taking into consideration that this is a topic that goes beyond those that are going to be affected per se seniors. For example, or to be more clear, I come from a heritage that is from Latin America, right? So seniors thinking in our heritage, in our cultural background, is a conversation that you do as a family, right? As a unit, you not necessarily individual, right? So I will be very interested to hear what are your thoughts about, for example, for thinking that way outside the box.
Folks, I just want to get there's always danger here. We're getting into that danger territory of me getting in the way of lunch. So I just want to make sure that we, but I want to hear just a couple of, so if part of your advocacy work going forward is to build connections with other potential sectors or allies that can create an environment that allows seniors to age and place properly in the Edmonton area, who else do you think we might want to think about engaging with? Anybody want to throw out a couple of examples?
So I'm Jasmine from Healthy Aging Alberta. So we talked a little bit about engaging intentionally with different cultural groups. So, you know, whatever that looks like here, but to do that in a very intentional way. Some of that's being done already, but those are very important allies because they represent some important stakeholders whose voices aren't always at the table.
Okay, so part of this work is thinking about who doesn't have a voice or are we not engaging with, and some of the ethnocultural communities could be that, and some of them are also highly organized. So if you make an entry point into that community, there's a lot of other people there that you can engage with.
This fits a little bit, but I do know that Alberta mentoring partnerships and like organizations like Big Brothers Big Sisters are dying for adults to act as mentors and be involved. So I think there could be some synergy there between organizations serving older populations and organizations serving younger populations.
Cool. Which even might be from a strategy point of view, an interesting kind of twist on challenging the narrative and making this an intergenerational effort. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, folks. Whoa, that's loud. Wendy Keeler from the city of Edmonton here. So at our table, we talked about a number of key allies, but one that came up was leaders, politicians, or advocates from other provinces, maybe that have had success, or even across the world that have had success with bringing together or advocating in this way that we're talking about.
Okay, so we don't need to necessarily just focus on the expertise in our own community. we can learn from other spaces and learn what their tactics have been and so forth. I'll take one more maybe, and then go ahead.
We were discussing community leagues and libraries. When we're thinking about that community-based system, we need to be engaging with other groups that are already running similar types of programs that we could expand for older adults.
Okay, so that's also looking at sort of getting a lay of the land and saying, okay, so where are these gathering places and places of connection? And so that might be a critical part of a long-term play that you have to build out that community of support. Okay. Sure, yeah, throw it, go ahead. Are they typing? Are they going to say it live or?
Sure, I can speak to it if you want. So from the online group, we heard a few things. One was cultural organizations were also really important. We heard that volunteers was another group that folks would want to reach, in seniors. And I think what was interesting about all of these is, to me, they all tie to seniors because many cultural organizations have seniors as their leaders. The volunteers in the senior sector are often seniors themselves that are running our programming and making things come alive. And I was even speaking to the fact that, like, seniors, to have that more directed and active effort to connect and have them feel integrated in design, I think would be really wonderful.
Okay, no, great, thank you. Yes, seniors is a key constituency here too, right? I mean, you want to avoid a situation which we've seen in other spaces where you start to speak on behalf of a community and that community in the process loses its voice, right? So lots of things to think about from the strategy point of view. I'm going to just jump ahead here because we're kind of heading close to time here. So let's assume that we did all this listening work, and today is part of that listening work. When you're listening to each other, you're actually hearing what are our common struggles and issues. You're hearing things about who might we work with. There's a lot of information that you're kind of gleaning if you go out and engage with people. The big challenge is, what do we do with that information, and can we kind of figure out how to make sense of it? So part of the thing that was critical when we were doing community organizing is to try to separate a problem from an issue, okay? Problems tend to be large things that are difficult and diffuse. So a problem might be something like poverty. It's very difficult to wrap your hands around how would we end poverty. And I think we've seen in Edmonton its challenges in doing that because it's such a big problem. It's much more actionable, however, to take a big problem and figure out, can we break it down into smaller issues or opportunities that could be winnable. And the reason you do that is because around smaller issues, it's a little bit easier sometimes to identify accountabilities. It's a little bit clearer to figure out who your allies might be. And if you pick something a bit smaller, you can build some momentum, because if you take on a challenge that's too big and you fail, where nothing happens, you just spin your wheels for 3 years. That's a recipe for people disengaging from your work. So we typically looked at it as sort of the differentiation between problems and issues is that problems are kind of large and entrenched things. They're very difficult to get your handle around. A problem typically consists of multiple intersecting issues. Problems tend to be complex, and it's very difficult sometimes to assign accountability to a problem. Whereas if you can cut it down to a smaller issue, like a policy or a program or a funding, it's a little narrower in scope. It's likely that you can act upon it more effectively, and you can actually figure out who are the key stakeholders that are implicated around this issue. So using the example of the difference between tackling poverty versus something else, I mean, affordable housing might be a more winnable issue, but even that one's very big. So you might need to cut it down to a particular opportunity to build seniors housing in a particular neighborhood, right? So it's even some of these, even cutting it, sometimes you end up with something that's a little bit big. But the key part of all your listening is to kind of figure out as you listen, which are the things that we think we can do something about. And in many cases, if we're talking about shifting systems here, we're actually trying to figure out which parts of the system are we trying to have influence over. So some of your work might be aimed at policies that you feel need to be changed. Some could be positioned at certain practices that you feel need to be changed. It could even be that you're trying to influence resource flows, how money flows in the system. And at the deeper level, you might be trying to actually change some of the relationships and power dynamics in the system that you're trying to affect, and ultimately get deeper at a mental model level. So in the story from BC, we heard lots of examples where fundamental relationships were starting to change between the healthcare system and community-based supports. Out of that came some changes, perhaps in power dynamics, where all of a sudden now they're moving more towards co-creation than before. Through all of that deeper work, there's actual shifts happening in resource flows, moving potentially to multi-year funding, changes in policies, et cetera. And at a very deep level, probably changes in the way that the healthcare system even thinks about what healthcare is. Some of that's at play. And at play here in the Edmonton context as well. So planning and acting. Want to zip through this really quick here. On this slide, which I'll share with you, you can kind of see different strategies people take based on their advocacy approach. So up here, for example, this is where you've got advocacy strategies that are very aimed at mobilization. You've got advocacy strategies aimed at things like litigation. Down here, you have advocacy that's more aimed at things like awareness raising, stuff aimed at shifting people's political will on issues. Each of these postures kind of has different levels of sort of mental models that you need to take if you're playing in those spaces. So part of what you figure out when you're working in an advocacy space is which of these spaces are we most comfortable in? And which of these spaces do we need to act in order to affect change? Okay, we'll zip through that. Key part of the thinking process of advocacy is always to think about action, reaction. And I think this is sometimes where we miss the boat. Your advocacy efforts are an action that you're thinking about how it's going to create a particular reaction, right? So it's always thinking about what's the outcome that we're trying to create. And your tool potentially is a tool that you can act and use, the declaration, to create certain reactions. Now, we don't have a lot of time to talk here, unfortunately, but my sense is that there's certain reactions that the declaration could create as a tool. One is it might create a sense of internal solidarity, a sense that we stand together on this. It's also an external facing tool that a decision maker or another stakeholder can see and says, here's the flag that this group has put in the ground. So it has many different purposes, potentially a declaration. The question is, how will you use it to create the desired reactions you want, either internally focused or externally focused? Because as a tool, it's just that. It's how you leverage it. Now, there are different types of advocacy actions you can take. Okay, so as you think about advocacy, it's really a suite of things that you might do to create change. One, some of this stuff might be geared at where you're doing advocacy to dig into an issue. So some of your meetings with people is to gain critical information on an issue, get deeper understanding of that issue so you can use that to drive your strategies. Some of it might be that you do some advocacy things where the purpose is to build a public relationship. You're doing something primarily where the outcome you're looking for is a shift in a relationship or a new ally. You could do some advocacy stuff that's about accountability. So these are situations where you might, where an action might be about making sure that somebody holds true to their agreements. And you can certainly evaluate that. I mean, Are they holding true to their agreements? Some of the advocacy stuff gets at a deeper level where you're trying to, like I said, some of your advocacy could have a cultural component to it. Sometimes things like summits are big declarations of our deeper values. And then some of your work might be to actually access and build new resources, get new finances, and you can certainly potentially evaluate that as well. Okay, last few things here. Okay, so typical tactics. This is sometimes people wonder what does this mean in the real world? Some of your tactics might be face-to-face stuff that you do. So if your purpose is to try to build relationships with people, a good way of doing that is doing one-to-one meetings, going out and identifying key leaders in your community, meeting with them to try to figure out, to get to know them, to build a relationship, understand their interests. Some of your actions might be grassroots campaigns that you run. Some of it might be that you sit down and you want to meet with an official, like somebody at the city or somebody at a government department. Some of your actions might end up being negotiations one day. And then on the communications end of things, there's lots of sort of actions people take that are largely about communication. And that includes things like media actions, writing campaigns, letters to the editor. Back in the day when I organized, that was a tool. I don't know if people read letters to the editor anymore, but a lot of seniors might. So it might be a strategy. And then there's nonpartisan things that you can do. Like you can host you could, for example, host a forum during the next election where you invite all of the candidates to come and speak about how they are going to support seniors. So you're organizing the political event and you're going in there with a set of questions that you have. So that could be some of the work you might do. And how it might boil out potentially maybe you build a campaign that has different actions and different outcomes that you're looking for. So here's an example of what it might look like. Maybe you decide that you have a particular objective here. And what you're going to do is who you're aiming to create an effect on is a particular ministry or the general public. And your approach that you're going to take is you're going to get an editorial into the Edmonton Journal where you're thinking if we do that, it'll create a little bit of a buzz for the politicians that pay attention to that stuff. You're going to aim that at a particular moment in time. Let's get an editorial in by February. That might be one of your tactics. Another tactic might be, we know that we're going to have a conference and we know that we're inviting the minister to that conference. So maybe part of it is to try to get a meeting with the minister. It could be something like that. And you could have other tactics that you weave through that are aimed more at a general audience. So maybe you have a social media campaign that you're running simultaneously. So that just shows you that your advocacy, if you were to develop an advocacy strategy, it might have embedded within it a number of tactics and approaches. And it's kind of you're trying to blend the air game with the ground game. How many of you have been involved with municipal elections, for example? Okay, so what's the air game? Well, the air game is kind of like the broad messaging that you do. It's high level. It might be the signs that you put out. It might be the messages, the advertising you buy, might be the air game. The ground game in a political campaign is the door-to-door stuff you do. And so quite often successful campaigns blend the air game and the ground game, and the ground game really matters. So as you think about your advocacy work, some of it might be at the higher level messaging stuff, and some of it could be right at the lower level, having one-to-one meetings with people. So your approach would blend some of this stuff. Okay, I think we are probably almost at lunch, but is there any quick reactions to any of this theory that I threw at you? before we go and do something very practical, which is grabbing food? Okay, well, thank you for your time. This is here as a resource for you. It's certainly not giving you the answers of what to do, but it's giving you hopefully some tools that can be helpful as you think about what you might do. Okay, I appreciate that we had the chance to talk to each other.
Thank you, Peter. Peter, thank you for your thoughtful presentation. You've provided us with a lot of information to consider and take forward to our table talks after lunch. So it is now time for lunch. We're going to, during lunch, you can feel free to get up to the board over here and sign your name on the declaration if you choose to, and we'll have time in the afternoon to do that as well. So lunch will be served at the back there, and we'll start with tables 1 to 7. Can head on up, and then we'll call the next few tables in a few minutes.
Okay, here's the very exciting part of the day. I don't know if you guys actually knew there was a door prize, but there is. So as Jan said, there's 2 door prizes, one for virtual and one for you lovely folks who are here. I was given the note with the draw winners' names in it, and I hope you will enjoy it. The draw winner who's here in person gets to pick which one they want, whereas the virtual one, sorry, you're gonna get the one that's left over. So can I get a drum roll? No, there's not. Oh, okay. So the in-person winner is, and I apologize if I say your name wrong, Doug Batchelder. Is Doug here? Oh, Doug, wonderful. Congratulations, Doug. Please come and claim your prize. And then virtual, are you listening, virtual? I don't know if they're even here for lunch yet. I might have to announce that once we get started, actually. They might not be connected. Come up, please, Doug. Please choose one of these lovely prizes. They both include 2 bottles of wine, so you're not going to lose either way. But there's other things in there. You can take your time, Doug. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for coming today. Wonderful. Okay. And I don't think maybe we have the virtual people here. I don't think I will do the announcement maybe when we get back. Oh, they're all off. Okay, I'll just wait until we get started, which we actually should be getting started now. Well, I'll make the announcement, and I actually know this person, so it's not rigged, I promise. I did not draw it, but the online winner is Helen Lightfoot, actually. So I'll contact her and tell her that she won. So wonderful. We're going to move on with our agenda. Hopefully you guys enjoyed lunch, and I think there's still food back there. So please mosey on back and get seconds if you'd like. So we're going to move on. Sorry, too exciting. So let's keep going. Our network is designed to build connections and support collaborative action. We want to ensure that everyone understands the way to engage in and support the network. So our lovely Jan Beeston, a member of our interim collective leadership group, and the executive director of the Jewish Family Services of Edmonton, will now provide us an overview on the ways to engage. Thank you, Jan.
Yes, please. Okay. There we go. Thank you. So network leadership's all about coalition building, working and leading together, and building, as Peter says, our capacity to act. And so thank you all for joining us today. And we're really excited to continue this work together into the future. And to do that, I'm going to share with you some of the ways that you can engage. So there are currently 3 main ways to engage in the network. And because we just got started, it's very early in the development of this network. We can expand these as we go. But we're looking forward to growing those opportunities for engagement as we get better at setting our collective priorities and sharing resources and welcoming new participants.
Okay. Oops. So the first way is the network gatherings. Anyone is welcome to join those network gatherings. That's not about whether or not you've signed the declaration. It's anybody who's interested in senior serving organizations or senior services. It is an open network, and those gatherings are online or in person. Today's in-person event is actually a pretty rare event, but we can optimistically look forward to more of these in the future. Most of you are probably more familiar with the online gatherings, and those will continue to on a regular basis. Also, the Edmonton Seniors Coordinating Council has a monthly link letter, which is our primary means of communication for upcoming events. And that newsletter is a venue for ongoing news from around the network. And in particular, the Edmonton Seniors Coordinating Council's communication staff invite your contributions into that newsletter in the collaborative corner section. We currently, the second one is the action hubs. And we currently have 2 action hubs on the go, but it's also an area of opportunity, a way to grow and bring issues into the network that we can work on together. Okay. So besides the 2 action hubs, our leadership transition is the big focus for us right now. The interim group has almost completed our work, and we're ready to pass the baton to a new group of leaders. Some members of the interim group have agreed to continue to serve for another term and to assure a well-supported succession process and to provide some continuity as we flow through. But we need your help to identify new leadership candidates. And from a personal experience as part of the interim collective leadership group, I just want to say that being part of that group is not only a way to contribute, but it's also a way to learn and grow and develop your network. And it's been an amazing experience for me. And so I encourage people to think about joining the interim leadership group. Our network leadership is really unique. It's not directorial kind of a leadership. It's a very engaged one. Networks aren't organizations. We don't need a board of directors, but we're looking for people who'll take on the roles and then be collectively creative in moving forward with us. Sometimes that means going with the slow flow and change, but sometimes that means being a challenger or a voice of dissension to spur conversation and creativity and new thinking. And it's actually fun. So we work hard, but it's really a fun group and fun to be part of. It's very seldom a dull moment, and the leadership group is always well supported by the Edmonton Seniors Coordinating Council as our backbone organisation. We're committed to equity, diversity and inclusion, and we readily admit that we don't quite know what that will mean in our future, but we have found and identified gaps, and we hope to recruit into those gaps. We've drafted an initial terms of reference for the stewardship group as we transition from the interim collective leadership group, and we fully know that it may change. The terms of reference may change as this group forms and better defines what type of leadership is best for our particular context. So you'll notice that one of our table talk options is to join a conversation about this leadership opportunity. So please come to this table talk if you have any ideas or questions or advice about building or supporting this new group. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan, so much for that presentation. If there's any questions, please, yes, we're going to be the table right here, I promise. Jan's going to introduce the next section, and I'm going to try to point which direction.
So yes, as we were saying, that we're going to have now an opportunity to explore. Any school host will explain the process and opportunities available to you now. So I think they're going to shut that down and yeah. So each in-person participant will be able to participate in 2 table talks, which are both 20 minutes in length. So there's 6 topics to choose from. These topics will be, they're presented on the screen there with a brief description of each. I don't see a brief description of each, but that's okay. They're kind of self-explanatory, I guess. So, pardon, oh, on the back of your agenda. Okay, perfect. So select the first topic that interests you and go to that number assigned to your table talk. You'll see that the table talks titles with assigned numbers are posted around the room. So for example, table talk 1 is network leadership. Number two is sector advocacy, and that's at the back corner of the room. Somebody's waving back there. Number 3 is age-friendly Edmonton, and that's table 1 near the windows. Healthy aging Alberta is near table 12. Somebody's waving. Social prescribing is at the back of the room, left of the food tables. And coordinated outreach is near table 9 by the windows. Okay. So everybody, when you hear somebody ring the bell, then it's time to move to the second table talk. So at that time, please change tables quickly so that everyone can participate in the 2 table talks. And there'll be opportunities for continued networking afterwards once the conclusion of the summit has finished. So we know that table topics will have different levels of interest. So don't worry if your group is too large or too small. If your first choice is kind of overwhelmed, then I suggest you just go to your second choice. And if you have any questions, just ask your table host for some assistance. So without further ado, you can move to your table talks. Thank you, everybody.
12th. Yeah. And so you can use the QR code on your agenda or wait for the email. Thank you so much for participating and coming today. I definitely learned a lot today. And this brings our formal summit program to an end. Thank you very much.